Welcome to this session on constructing effective assignments, problem sets, and exam questions. In this session, we will have an introduction to this session's goals and learning objectives. Then we will discuss the logistics of implementing assessments in your course, and end with the development of effective assessment questions. The goal of this session is to illustrate how to apply Bloom's taxonomy to design effective homework and exam questions. We will discuss how to create effective questions that reach all cognitive levels of Bloom's taxonomy, especially the higher cognitive levels, which can be very difficult. Our goal in this session is to create questions that will assess whether our students have met our learning objectives. The learning objectives of this session are that by the end of this session, you will have considered ways to 1. Formulate and organize the use of assignments in your course to enhance student learning. 2. Evaluate homework and exam problems using Bloom's taxonomy. 3. Create homework and exam problems that align with your learning objectives. This session will provide you with many opportunities for hands-on activities as you work on evaluating questions and constructing your own effective assessment questions. Let's start this session by brainstorming the characteristics of effective assessment methods. What do you think are characteristics of effective problem set or exam questions? Pause the video now while you write down your ideas. Now that you've had a chance to think of some of the characteristics of effective assessment questions, let's go through a few of our ideas together. Effective assignment questions are clearly written, and the expectations of the student's answers are well defined. Instructions, if necessary, are clearly written. Effective questions provide just the right amount of challenge to the students and are neither too hard nor too easy. In some cases, you may choose to have extra challenging questions that may be worth bonus points at the end of an assignment. You can inspire your students by incorporating real-world problems and authentic situations into your assignments. Finally, it is important to remember that effective questions are related to the course material, or their reasons for diverging are clearly specified. In this session, we are going to continue our discussion of the backward design process and talk about the creation of effective assignments, problem set, and exam questions to determine whether students get the material. The first step of the backward design process, which is the creation of learning objectives, or goals, for the things that you would like your students to know and be able to do by the end of the course. In this session, we will discuss the creation of effective assessments to determine whether your students have reached your intended learning objectives. Then, in other sessions, we will discuss the creation of instructional experiences to help your students reach your intended learning objectives. This session on the effective homework and exam questions will be divided into two parts. First, we will discuss the logistics of assessment methods. Then, in the second part, we will discuss the development of these assessments. Let's talk about logistics first. When thinking about assessments for your course, it is important to keep several logistics in mind. First, you need to determine the frequency of your assignments. At MIT, in science, technology, engineering, and math courses, having weekly or bi-weekly assignments is common. This frequency of assignments serves to provide your students with many opportunities for practice at retrieval, which we learned about in an earlier session. Remember, deliberate practice is required to reach a high or expert level of performance. It is also important to remember that the practice opportunities must provide activities that motivate students to improve their performance. In addition, having frequent assignments provides you, the instructor, with opportunities to see how well your students are learning. By pacing assignments regularly throughout the course, students are more likely to exhibit regular study habits and will have decreased tendencies to procrastinate. It is important to keep in mind that assignments should coordinate with your lecture topics. Assignments should not require information, skills, or techniques that have not been covered in the course. If an assignment does diverge from the course material, it is important to explain the reasons for doing so. There are two cases in which assignments may not align with the course material. The first case is having pre-class assignments that students complete prior to attending class. The purpose of pre-class assignments is for students to read or even watch a pre-recorded lecture prior to coming to class. The class period can then be devoted to problem-solving sessions. This method, sometimes referred to as a flipped classroom, is used by Professor Eric Mazur at Harvard University. The second case is having pre-tests. Pre-tests are used to gauge students' level of knowledge prior to the course or a section. Instructors can then adjust the material covered in class accordingly to align with the level of prior knowledge and students' misconceptions. When planning the course's assessments, the instructor should specify the collaboration policy. For example, are students allowed to work together to solve the problems? Perhaps students can work together to identify a problem-solving strategy, but each student is required to solve the problem individually. Whatever your collaboration strategy is, make sure to specify it on your course syllabus. The instructor should provide students with tips on solving problems. Tips are especially important for students who may lack the necessary experience or strategies to solve problems effectively. There are several strategies that students can use when solving problems. For example, one strategy is for a student to write out all of the information that is requested by the problem. The student can also write down all of the information that is provided in the problem. Some students may find it's useful to break the problem into small parts and solve each of these smaller parts, possibly with the easiest steps first. By providing your novice students with problem-solving strategies, you, as the expert, will help your students reach an expert level of thinking. It is important to provide feedback on students' work in a timely fashion. When I refer to feedback, I am not just referring to a grade on the problem. Instead, I am referring to the process of identifying a student's mistakes and providing individualized feedback on their problem-solving strategy. This type of individualized feedback will enable your students to learn from their mistakes and identify their misconceptions. As the instructor, you should not only provide solutions to all of your assignments, you should also provide individualized feedback. Don't worry though, you may be panicking, believing that this will be an incredibly difficult task to achieve given the constraints of your course. It is important to note that you don't need to grade every question on every assignment. One strategy is to grade a few questions on each assignment, but don't tell your students in advance which questions will be graded. By not telling your students which questions will be graded, your students will provide a high level of effort on all questions. Another strategy is to give your students ungraded assignments with solutions, and then administer graded quizzes to evaluate their understanding of the assignment material. Keep in mind that while providing feedback is important, having students incorporate your feedback is an even more important learning process. If you are teaching a course with teaching assistants, they may need help in grading and providing the appropriate feedback. In these cases, providing well-written grading rubrics to your teaching assistants is an effective way to ensure that grading is consistent across all members of the teaching staff and that the teaching assistants are well-versed in providing constructive feedback. The last step is to check in with students to gauge how long the assignments are taking them to complete. By checking in with students to see how long the assignments are taking, you will be able to determine whether they are too easy or too challenging. This process is especially important both at the beginning of a course and when you are teaching at a new institution with a new population of students. This will ensure that your assessments are of an appropriate level. Now that we have talked about specifics regarding the logistics of assessments, let's talk about how we develop effective assignment and exam questions. When you are developing your assessments, consider making the first assignment a review or using a pretest. This first assignment can serve as a means to provide yourself with information regarding the prior knowledge of your students. The first assignment can also serve as a pretest. If you administer the same quiz at the end of the course, which is called a post-test, then you can assess the learning gains of your students. When developing questions, vary the sources and types of materials that you use. Instead of using all textbook problems for your course, try to obtain questions from many different sources. such as other colleagues and different reference materials. Also, using real-world examples to provide authentic assessment questions can motivate and engage your students in learning. Another consideration is to develop questions that meet many different cognitive levels of Bloom's taxonomy and require different sets of knowledge to complete. It is important to not only align your questions with your learning objectives, but also to make sure that your assignment questions are consistent with your exam questions and that they address a wide range of cognitive levels. Also consider providing extra questions at the end of a problem set that are more challenging to encourage your students to move beyond the basic course content. Identifying the method that students use to solve a problem will provide you with information regarding your students' thought processes. Consider having students describe in words how they solved a problem. This process will provide you with insight regarding how students address your problems. The last point to consider when developing questions is to make sure that you have validated your problems prior to assigning them to your students. Before assigning the problems to your students, review each problem for length, clarity, difficulty level, and errors. In addition, if you have recently completed the problem, then it will be easier for you to help students solve the problem, perhaps during your office hours. This review process is especially important when you are developing exam questions. Let's have a discussion on the pre-session readings that you completed prior to viewing this session. The pre-session readings were, first, Chapter 10 on Creating an Effective Assignment from a book called Assessing Student Learning, A Common Sense Guide by Linda Susky. And second, an article titled Ersatz Learning in Authentic Testing by John McClymer and Lucia Knowles. What were your reactions to the readings? Do you have any questions or comments about the readings? Do you have any experience with a course that did not have meaningful assessments? How can we develop more meaningful problems or authentic testing situations to prepare our students? Pause the video here while you first post your responses on the online course discussion forum, and second, respond to your peers' reactions and questions. Now we will go through an example of developing questions that address each level of Bloom's taxonomy. Let's say that I am teaching elementary school children the math concept of addition. During this exercise, we will create one problem for each cognitive level of Bloom's taxonomy, and by the end, we will have developed 6 new questions. Let's start with the Remember level of Bloom's taxonomy. What question would you write for the Remember level of Bloom's taxonomy? Pause the video now while you think of a question. The question that we came up with is, match the following simple addition problems with their correct solutions. Now, what question would you write for the Understand level of Bloom's taxonomy? Pause the video now while you think of a question. Our Understand level question is, explain the concept of addition in a sentence using an example that uses fruit. What question would you write for the Apply level of Bloom's taxonomy? Pause the video now while you think of a question. Our example Apply level question is, using your knowledge of addition, solve the following problem. And the instructor would need to provide the problem. Now, what question would you write for the Analyze level of Bloom's taxonomy? Pause the video now while you think of a question. An example Analyze level question is, what would happen to the solution of the following problem if one of the numbers becomes equal to 0? Explain. Now, what question would you write for the Evaluate level of Bloom's taxonomy? Pause the video now while you think of a question. Our example Evaluate question is, find the mistakes in the following problem. Justify your answer. and the instructor would need to provide the actual problem in this case. Now, what question would you write for the Create level of Bloom's taxonomy? Pause the video now while you think of a question. Our example Create level question is, develop your own addition problem using odd numbers. Be sure to provide the solution to your problem. I hope that this exercise of creating example questions that address each cognitive level of Bloom's taxonomy has been helpful to you. This exercise illustrates how well-designed questions can help you determine whether students have attained the specific cognitive level of each of your learning objectives. Now you will have the opportunity to evaluate the cognitive level of a problem, and then develop new problems that are at higher and lower cognitive levels of Bloom's taxonomy. In this pair-share activity, work with one other person from a similar discipline. First, select one problem from the handout of sample problems. Identify the problem's core concept, and determine the current cognitive level of Bloom's taxonomy that characterizes the problem. Then, work together to develop two new questions that address the same underlying concept. One of your new questions should address a lower cognitive level, and the other question should address a higher cognitive level of Bloom's taxonomy. If the problem that you selected is already at the highest or lowest cognitive level of Bloom's taxonomy, then create two new problems that are at different cognitive levels. If you have the opportunity, we recommend that you share your findings and one of your problems with a larger group through the online forums. Pause the video now while you complete this activity. Now that you have had a chance to review the example questions on the handout and move one of the problems up and down Bloom's taxonomy, let's go through one of the examples together. For this exercise, I have chosen question 2. This question reads, a motorcycle police officer starts from rest at point A 2 seconds after a car, speeding at the constant rate of 120 kilometers per hour, passes point A. If the officer accelerates at the rate of 6 meters per second squared until he reaches his maximum permissible speed of 150 kilometers per hour, which he maintains, calculate the distance x from point A to the point where he overtakes the car. The main concepts of this question are velocity and acceleration, and the current cognitive level of this question is apply. This question is an apply level question because it is asking the student to plug the numbers provided in the question into an equation to solve for distance. I think it is important to point out that even though this question is a level 3 question, it is simply requiring students to plug numbers into an equation and solve it, which is not very cognitively demanding. This fact is important to keep in mind as you develop questions for your own course. Now I'll go through example questions moving down and up Bloom's taxonomy. I'll provide 2 example questions that are at a lower cognitive level and 2 that are at a higher cognitive level. I'm going to first provide examples of the lower cognitive level questions. An example remember question is, define velocity in a sentence, using words and not equations. An example understand question is, explain a real-world situation in which an object has changing velocity. Now I'll provide 2 example questions of higher cognitive level questions. An example evaluate question is, what happens if, in the provided question, constant acceleration does not apply? An example create question is, create a problem in which students will have to make an assumption about constant acceleration. Now that you have worked with one other person to evaluate the cognitive level of problems and move the problem up and down Bloom's taxonomy, you will have the opportunity to do the same activity with a problem that is directly related to a course that you teach or would like to teach. First, select one problem from your textbook. Identify the concept that the problem is addressing, and determine the current cognitive level of Bloom's taxonomy of the problem. Then write 2 new questions that address the same underlying concept. One of the problems should address a higher cognitive level, and the other problem should address a lower cognitive level. If the problem that you selected is already at the highest or lowest cognitive level of Bloom's taxonomy, then create 2 new problems that are at different cognitive levels. After you have developed 2 new problems, share your work with one other person and work together to refine your questions. If you have the opportunity, we recommend that you share your work with a larger group. Pause now while you complete this activity. In this session on the construction of effective assessment questions, we first discussed the logistics of incorporating assessments in your course, and the development of effective questions that incorporate real-world, authentic situations to engage your students in the learning process. At the end of the session, you had the opportunity to evaluate the cognitive level of example problems using Bloom's taxonomy, and develop your own problems to determine whether your students have attained your course learning objectives. Any questions or comments? Take a moment to write any lingering questions or comments that you may have on the discussion forum now. The post-session assignment for this session is to use Bloom's taxonomy to develop a set of questions or problems that address the student's cognitive development at each level of Bloom's taxonomy for one of the concepts for which you created a learning objective previously. At the end of this assignment, you will have developed 6 new questions, one for each level of Bloom's taxonomy. On your assignment, be sure to include the concept that you are teaching and the appropriate learning objective or learning objectives that you wrote previously. Please see the instructions on the course website for information regarding the submission of your assignment. Immediately following your viewing of this session, please follow the link to the online survey for the mud card.